Breath of the Wild was an overwhelmingly successful game. Like many Zelda titles before it, it has been received incredibly positively and is incredibly popular. It's a fun, well-designed game. It's my favorite 3D Zelda game, closely followed by Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask, however, was the sequel to what many call the greatest game of all time. I'm sure that before too long, people will begin to see Breath of the Wild's flaws and return to calling Ocarina of Time the best Zelda, but we're in a situation right now very much like that of when Ocarina of Time was the new hotness. Question has to be asked, what's next? Where does Zelda go from here? In Majora's Mask's case, it was a complete departure from the design of the game it was based off of. With its famous one-year development period, Majora's Mask had many assets and familiar faces from Ocarina of Time, but was completely different on a gameplay level. Majora's Mask focused on the things that Ocarina's engine did well, and used the items and people familiar from Ocarina to tell a brand new story. Today, I'm going to discuss what I would do if I were in Nintendo's shoes, and talk about what I would do if I were in charge of making a sequel to Breath of the Wild. To begin, I would do a lot of what Majora's Mask did with Ocarina of Time. I would reuse Breath of the Wild's assets and engine, but create a new world with new dungeons and a new central mechanic to greatly differentiate this game from its predecessor. My sequel to Breath of the Wild would take place in a darker version of Hyrule, fittingly known as Dark Hyrule. Much like Majora's Mask, this game will have a pretty dark atmosphere to it, and it would probably use a less drastic version of Breath of the Wild's dark area lighting as the basic lighting for Dark Hyrule. Additionally, the few towns that would be peppered around Dark Hyrule would be somewhat dreary. While the towns in Breath of the Wild usually have hopeful, peaceful, or even fun music, the music in the towns of Dark Hyrule would be a bit more melancholy and slower, maybe even sad. Additionally, the townspeople would rarely leave their own homes, would have a pile of problems they have to deal with, and would generally be closer to tears than Zelda's English voice acting. I feel as though this would contrast greatly with Breath of the Wild's towns and people, since they seem hopeful and relaxed even though Hyrule is supposedly in ruins now. As for the story of this game, I would have a pretty basic Zelda formula-friendly story in which the light of the land has been stolen by whoever and now must be restored to bring back peace to Dark Hyrule. Each dungeon completed would restore one piece of the land's light, gradually brightening the overworld and bringing Link closer to the final boss. To fill in why Breath of the Wild's Link is here, a short introduction cutscene would show Zelda messing around with some newly discovered Sheikah tech, and by it malfunctioning, she gets sucked into a portal, taking her to Dark Hyrule, and Link, as her appointed knight, or even better yet, her husband or boyfriend, jumps in after her. As an added bonus, it could be something like a Sheikah mirror, to keep in the Zelda tradition of sending people to other worlds through mirrors, like in A Link to the Past and Twilight Princess. The intro sequence would take place on an island which is disconnected from the rest of Dark Hyrule. On this island, there will be an introductory dungeon which introduces the player to this game's dungeons and new mechanics. After completing this first dungeon, the player will be allowed to leave the island and explore the rest of Dark Hyrule, essentially opening all the remaining dungeons up after the introductory one. Someone on the island, before leaving, will fill Link in on the plight of Dark Hyrule, but importantly, not request his help. The general tone of this world is one of discouragement, so the idea that someone is here to save the world isn't one that would be entertained by most individuals living here. Nonetheless, Link and possibly Zelda, if she can manage not to be captured by the bad dude, decide to save this world. It would be completely okay if Zelda accompanied Link, at least sometimes on his journey here. This would allow them to have some sort of relationship, get to know each other better, possibly allow the player to play as Zelda, and even let Zelda help out in combat, as Dark Hyrule would be a world filled with monsters far worse than those in normal Hyrule. The monsters being more difficult would partly be for atmosphere, but it would also be to accommodate the player bringing the Master Sword with them to Dark Hyrule and justify enemies not instantly dying to it early on in the game. Ultimately, the story could be told modularly from this point, with each area of the map having their own troubles to deal with as a result of the world generally sucking and being in an environment different from the rest of the world. However, the story would end when the player beats one final dungeon, unlocked after the rest are completed. Pretty simple stuff, and very formula-friendly. The stories of the different towns and the different areas of the world, the stories of the dungeons, and the stories of Link and Zelda going through this adventure together would be the important story to tell with this game. That being said, let's move on to the dungeons and how they would work in the game. Dark Hyrule would be a Hyrule in which Sheikah Tech either never existed or was never discovered thanks to the discouragement of the people. This means that dungeon aesthetics would be unique to each dungeon, the towers would not exist, and Sheikah Slate functionality would be altered to fit the needs of the game, additionally meaning that shrines would not be a thing. This being said, I like the idea of shrines. To replace them, I would add in some similar puzzles just to the overworld. Puzzles like those of the shrines, but instead of being instanced off under the ground, they would be integrated into the architecture and aesthetics of the surrounding area. Ruins areas would have statues and fallen columns as structure for the puzzles instead of generic black and beige blocks with blue glowy effects. Foresty areas may have a wooden structure upon which the puzzle was built, and grassy areas may have some stones arranged in a peculiar pattern. Essentially, these would be a cross between Korok puzzles and shrines, with their location being in the overworld, but each one is unique and requires a fair bit of thought to solve. But why are these puzzles here? Who put it here? And why is there a reward at the end? Figure these questions could be solved with some environmental storytelling. Perhaps some traveler who was oblivious to the world's problems enjoyed making puzzles, and he leaves a journal in the treasure chest with whatever rewards he puts at the end of his puzzles. Alternatively, some mischievous race of creatures like to put puzzles everywhere, or even some are just the result of natural wear and tear on some ruins which contained a treasure chest anyways. Proper dungeons in this sequel would be significantly different from those of Breath of the Wild. The Divine Beasts always had a questline attached to them, involving the race of the people who lived nearby. This would not be the case for the dungeons of my sequel. Instead, dungeons would just be littered across the overworld, simply demanding the player find them through exploration. Some individuals in the world may give hints to their whereabouts, but never would there be a quest that led to them specifically. However, after completing them, it would be completely okay to have some side quests that demand you return there. That way these dungeons aren't completely isolated from the narrative. For instance, having a chat with a villager causes his whole demeanor to change when you inform him you have X item from Y dungeon. He will then request you go back to the dungeon, either with a new item or with new information which allows you to do more within that dungeon. Additionally, these dungeons should all be connected to the final boss in some way, since the bosses at the end of each dungeon award the player with some of Dark Hyrule's light. To do this, I would say that the bosses should be underlings or minions to some degree of the big bads. Conversations with the bosses, or a visit from the final boss during this confrontation, will allow you to interact with and develop a bit of a relationship to him. That way he isn't just evil for the sake of being evil when you finally fight him. Dungeons will distinguish themselves from the overworld puzzles in a key way. They will be significantly larger, with a large number of interconnected rooms. The focus of these will be more on the aspect of navigating the dungeon and understanding its layout instead of just being able to solve the puzzles within, although that will be a key part of dungeons. Distinguishing themselves further from the overworld puzzles and dungeons of Breath of the Wild, these dungeons will have more difficult combat that can be expected from standard enemies. Enemies in dungeons will be more akin to the enemies in Hyrule Castle, but maybe not that much harder. Before I move on, I suppose I should mention what I would add as this game's new mechanic, or the game's main gimmick. I would allow Link to tame some specific, unique animals in the overworld, which he could summon for a short time to assist him with puzzles or help him out in combat. These pets would be found at locations in the overworld and would require some real thought to tame, each one having their own method of being tamed and being their own puzzle in their own right. The lore for these creatures could be something along the lines of being the beasts of light, animals who were gifted with some divine power, granting them wisdom and intelligence beyond that of other animals, and giving them enhanced powers of their own species. A bird similar to a loftwing could be one, as well as a wolf, which looked oddly like Wolf Link. A bear would be interesting, a horse could be one, and maybe a snake could also be an interesting addition. I came up with this idea thanks to seeing Wolf Link help out in Breath of the Wild. I figured it was an interesting mechanic and would be awesome to expand upon, much like how Majora's Mask actually made the Ocarina of Time have anything to do with time travel, instead of the Master Sword and the Temple of Time being responsible for that. These beasts of light would help Link solve puzzles in dungeons, and many dungeons may require a specific animal to get through. Additionally, each dungeon will be very similar to classic Zelda dungeons, awarding a new item about halfway through to give a new perspective on the puzzles in the dungeon. Some items I would love to see make a return are the magic boomerang, capable of locking onto multiple targets before returning to Link, elemental arrows. They appeared in Breath of the Wild, but as an expendable combat enhancer, not necessarily a puzzle-solving item. No, the divine beasts don't count. Strength bracers, allowing Link to push around bigger objects and improving his other abilities, such as greatly reducing stamina use when climbing and picking up rocks faster, or pushing things easier. The hook shot because it's fun. However, I would make a much larger number of surfaces compatible with it instead of specific points that you have to aim right at. Finding a specific thing to hookshot onto isn't puzzle solving. New items that I would like to see in this game would be something like a bottomless quiver, allowing Link never to run out of standard arrows. This could be made more powerful by increasing the price of arrows and increasing their rarity. An invulnerable shield instead of a nearly invulnerable shield like the Hylian shield in Breath of the Wild, but I'll get to combat here in a minute. The Sheikah Slate with its runes, which could be easily added to in addition to its scope and pins. So combat in Breath of the Wild is fun, and deeper than in any other Zelda. I would absolutely capitalize on this in Breath of the Wild's sequel. Combat would essentially be the same, but with some tweaks to item management and how items are designed. In Breath of the Wild, one of the most annoying things, at least from a surface level, is weapon fragility. Weapons break all the time, and having to go through your inventory, even if it's through the quick menu, is frustrating and breaks the pace of battle. Additionally, being able to pause and eat food at any time takes the tension out of battle. To remedy this, I would vastly reduce the inventory size of your meal menu, perhaps down to just 5 meals. As for weapons, I would also greatly reduce down your total weapon count, likely to as low as 5 weapons, plus the Master Sword, and only 3 to 5 bows. One of these bows would be an unbreakable weapon, but it'll have mediocre stats. Additionally, the Master Sword will be unbreakable while in Dark Hyrule. These weapons will be assigned to the default weapon slot, with menu navigation required to assign an alternative weapon. And that's it. Instead of having a quick menu, pressing the left directional button will instantaneously toggle between your default weapon and your alternative weapon. When your alternative weapon breaks, it will automatically switch back to your default weapon, no menu required. The same thing will be done for your bows, with a standard, default, unbreakable mid-tier bow as your default. These default weapons, however, can be upgraded by the blacksmith in one of the villages, much like in A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. That way, the difficulty of enemies in the games has room to increase, and difficulty can improve. Every weapon in the game that is dropped by enemies will be breakable, but many of them will have higher stats and damage output than the Master Sword and your default bow. They will, however, break in roughly the same amount of time as the weapons in Breath of the Wild. This means that the strategy in combat, as far as weapon choice goes, will be entirely based on whether you want to expend weapon durability in exchange for bonus damage on some of the tougher enemies in the game. You will be able to beat every enemy in the game, however, with the basic Master Sword and default bow. But enemies will be made quite easier with the weapon upgrades. In fact, it'll be quite difficult to beat endgame enemies with an unupgraded Master Sword, but still possible. Other than weapon management, combat would be essentially the same in my Breath of the Wild sequel. However, new enemy types would be necessary, and enemies who are formidable without weapons would complement the new weapon system well. Additionally, some new weapon types could be added, such as whips, which are slower than broadswords but deal more damage and allow you to use your shield, or throwing weapons, which allow you to throw several in quick succession but can't use them in melee combat and will quickly run out. Now for the last little bits, as this has already gone on for quite a while. First off, cooking would have some changes made to it, simply to reduce how often you can use food. Less cooking items will be found in the world. This will add to the dark atmosphere by contrasting the bountiful lands of Hyrule with the empty lands of Dark Hyrule. Additionally, this means you can cook less dishes, which is nice since the inventory is smaller. However, cooked dishes with the new herbs and cooking items found in Dark Hyrule will be more effective in general. Specifically, all effects they impart will be standardized to around 10 minutes long in duration, give or take depending on dungeon length and what would fit that. Additionally, only carrying 5 different meals will mean that health imparting food will be precious and should be conserved much like health. Finally, only having cooking pots in town will mean that each time you leave town, you will need to make all of your food last until you return, adding stakes to the combat. Without Sheikah Towers, unlocking the map will have to work differently. I think the best way to do this would be to add people into towns who sell portions of the map for a sizable chunk of change. This will add some value to rupees beyond what value they have for materials in Breath of the Wild, among other things. Additionally, side quests which reward whoopies. Additionally, side quests which reward... Good lord, I almost said it again. Additionally, side quests which reward rupees will be made that much more valuable. Paying different amounts of money for different levels of detail on maps would add a little bit more depth to this system as well. To accommodate player-driven exploration like in Breath of the Wild, though, Lots of high locations will have to be added into the world, and areas of interest will need to be very distinguishable from their surroundings. This was much easier in Breath of the Wild since the Sheikah architecture was already glowy with orange and blue. And that about does it for what I would do with a sequel to Breath of the Wild. I'm sure it's not perfect and has its problems, but I think it would solve some of the biggest issues that Breath of the Wild has, without completely changing the feel of it as well. I would love to see a game that focuses on Link and Zelda's relationship in gameplay as well as in story. Additionally, I was disappointed by the divine beasts in Breath of the Wild, so having proper, level-designed puzzles as dungeons would be wonderful. Ultimately, I think a dark atmosphere would be a good way to contrast the worlds of Breath of the Wild, which was melancholy on one hand, but also hopeful, if not cheery at times. And making the subtle change to the combat would still allow for decent rewards after fighting enemies, and fix the problem of having to swap weapons 3 times per encounter. Nonetheless, I have no doubt that my ramblings are less than what Nintendo can do, so I will end this by saying, do better, Nintendo. I think my sequel to Breath of the Wild would be interesting and fun, but I'm sure it's nothing compared to what Nintendo can do with a sequel to Breath of the Wild. If you agree with my idea for a sequel, or just liked my video, be sure to hit the like button. If you want to hear more of my lovely voice, be sure to subscribe, as I intend to start uploading videos on a bit more of a regular basis, maybe even releasing new videos weekly if I get enough views. No matter what, thank you for watching, and have a wonderful night.